Hi everyone, this is Biz Gormley at EPIP headquarters here in New York. I am really happy to be able to welcome us together in community today, November 9th, for the Advocacy and Grantmaking Working Together for Impact webinar. I'm joined by three presenters and we'll introduce them and give them space to say more about how they came to this work and what they do a little bit later. But for the first few minutes, I'd love to go through an intro, welcome you all here, and go over some housekeeping before we jump into today's presentation. The first thing I want to say is this slide is in the spirit of humor on a day that is not particularly funny. I want to just name that this is a very shocking day for many of us. This is a day when we are waking up in a new country than we lived in yesterday. And it's a day for many people, including women, many LGBTQ folks, many immigrants, many Muslim folks, many disabled folks, many people from many walks of life who have felt shock and trauma through the course of this election, to feel that in a whole new way than we thought possible. Other folks may be celebrating. There's a lot that is on the table now that perhaps was not seen before. And we all have a lot of work ahead of us, both in our own personal lives and also in the work we do on a day-to-day basis. I personally am truly grateful that this is the topic for today, because no matter how you feel today, the fact remains that electoral politics are not the only levers in our government, and the work we do at EPIP in hopes of helping develop leadership skills for all the folks in our community definitely relates to this today. You know, how can we think about ourselves as pushing on different kinds of levers and engaging government in ways that are not just going to the polls and voting. So we would welcome anyone who is feeling compelled or is interested in sharing to write into the question box either feelings or reflections that you're holding. We definitely are going to move into the content and focus on our planned presentation, but also honoring that today is a different day, wanted to give space for that kind of conversation as well. So please feel free to share your thoughts and reflections. If you would like them to be read out to the group, we're happy to hold a little space for those before we get into the content. And you're also welcome to not share. If you're new to EPIP, or if you haven't been here in a while, I did want to take a moment to just give you a little bit of a background on who we are as an organization. So EPIP stands for Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, and it is a national network of foundation professionals, social entrepreneurs, and other change makers who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. And our strategic planning process is well underway. You can definitely check out our website for more information about what we've been doing to consider where we're headed and where we've been in the first 15 years of EPIP and in the years ahead. But at the core of what we do is really a mission to cultivate and activate leaders in order to advance equity through philanthropy as well. We provide a platform for our community to connect with others, to learn and practice leadership skills, and to inspire emerging ideas in the social sector. If you have questions or you'd love to join anything that's coming to mind, would love to start a conversation. So please feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name's Biz, and my email is biz@epip.org. We also wanted to make sure you know that next week we have a special time webinar. It's going to be on Wednesday, our normal time, but it's at 11 a.m. because we are being joined by Frog Design's Impact team in London, and we need to make sure they can present before it's too late in the night. So join us for Design Thinking with Frog Design. It's going to be a chance to explore both the principles of human-centered design and think about how they apply to social challenges, social issues, and social organizations. You can register at epip.org/events, and also take a peek there for a variety of local chapter events and upcoming EPIP national events that we'd love to have you involved in. Some housekeeping for today's call. You can use the question box to let me know about any technical difficulties you may be having. If you can't hear us, if you are having trouble with the screen, etc., please just drop that issue into the question box, and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot. If you have questions that come up throughout the presentation, please also put those questions into that question box. Just type them in, and at the end we're going to have a session for Q&A, and we'll be sure to get to all your questions. We're doing a poll today, and it's anonymous. If you're going to be following us on Twitter with EPIP webinar, if you're going to be following us on Twitter, you can use the hashtag EPIP webinar to make sure we can see each other in the conversation online. We are recording the webinar so it can be included in our archive. And at the very end of the presentation, you'll receive a 7-question survey that's multiple choice, quite quick, and really helpful for us in terms of understanding what works, what doesn't, and what you'd like to see more of. So if you can take 30 seconds to fill that out, I really appreciate it. So before I introduce our speakers, would love to get a sense of who's on the line today and what kind of organizations you work for. So if you can just take a second to please answer the question that's popped up on your screen. Which of these descriptions best matches where you work? I'm going to leave it up for a couple more seconds if the last few folks would like to vote. All right. So it looks like the majority of folks today are from foundations, and then a good handful of people are also joining from nonprofits. Thank you. Welcome to everybody. So without further ado, I'm really thrilled to introduce 3 thoughtful and super talented people. Kristen Gurdon, Jasmine Hall-Ratliff, and Alan Madison are here with us today for the presentation. Kristen, I'm going to turn the tables over to you to get things started.
Thanks so much, Biz, and thanks to all of you for being here with us today. And I'm just going to make sure that you can see everything on my screen right now. Okay, so I hope you can see my screen at the moment. We're going to start today.
You can't see it yet. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you until it's up.
Okay. Not yet?
No, why don't I try to switch it again? One sec. Yep, perfect, thanks.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to start today with a tale of 2 proposals, a fairy tale, if you will, but it will be familiar to many of you. Once upon a time, there was Polly Program, who worked as a program officer at a private foundation, probably like many of you. And since she worked for a private foundation, she couldn't lobby or make grants that were earmarked for lobbying purposes. But one day, Polly got a grant proposal from a really well-respected advocacy organization called Promise Not Prisons. And Promise Not Prisons hadn't had much success in attracting other private foundation funds, but it was really well-respected for hard-hitting advocacy in the field, particularly around mass incarceration. And that's an issue that's a high priority for Polly's foundation. And Polly knew that this next legislative session was likely going to have relevant legislation about mass incarceration. And she knew that P&P, Promise Without Prisons, this potential grantee, had done a lot of good lobbying on this issue in a past session. But Promise Without Prisons proposal indicated that Polly's foundation would be the only funder of this work to introduce policymakers to the issue of mass incarceration and mass incarceration policies in a new way. And so in a typical foundation approach, Polly might review and perhaps bring in her legal counsel, look at the proposal and make sure that none of the activities appear to be lobbying, because if Polly's foundation is the only funder, then she can't fund a proposal that includes lobbying. If any of those activities looked questionable, she might ask the grantee to obtain other unrestricted funding for those activities, or she also might ask the grantee to alter those activities to make sure they weren't lobbying. And if the grantee couldn't get any other funding for the project, she would probably ask the grantee to sign a grant agreement saying that they wouldn't lobby on this project. And the grantee would sign it, and everyone would move on. And if Polly ever got a report that discussed lobbying on this project, she'd have to follow up with the grantee and make sure that they did have some other funds to engage in those activities or resolve it in some other way. Am I putting you to sleep so far? I know many of you probably didn't get a lot of sleep last night. But this is kind of a boring story. It's a typical story. And there's nothing terribly wrong with this approach. It's a way a lot of foundations approach their work. And in fact, it was the way that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation used to approach its work in many situations. But what if Polly took an entirely different approach? Imagine a different trajectory for this proposal that would take its impact to another level. What if, when Polly received this proposal from Promise Not Prisons, she looked to make sure that the grantee had the capacity, the authentic voice, and the likely opportunity to lobby? And so she gave them access to legal counsel who could help them strategize about how to use her funds effectively, the foundation funds, without crossing the line. That kind of legal assistance will do far more than just keep Polly's foundation out of trouble, because it can help to make sure the grantee knows how to use the lobbying rules to their full advantage. And it can allow the grantee to leverage their foundation funds, as well as any other limited restricted dollars, to seize important opportunities when they arise. So it's a far more opportunistic approach. And if she gives the grantee, Promise Not Prisons, this capacity, and they really learn mastery of these rules, they understand where the lines are, they understand how to use foundation funding appropriately and where unrestricted dollars are really needed, they will be better able to attract more funding from other private foundations in the future, an area where they haven't been successful. So they become a far more successful fundraising organization. Now, that treatment of proposal can be a real game changer, and that's really what we want to talk about today. So today, we will talk about what legal technical assistance is, how you can provide grantees access to very high quality legal counsel at a relatively low cost, what that looks like, and what it can really do for grantees and your programs, and how it can leave grantees better than you found them, and what that can do in terms of having a lasting impact on the issues that you care about. So I'm going to turn it over to Jasmine to talk about who should care about legal technical assistance from the program officer perspective. But I want to emphasize today that what started as a legal compliance journey for us when we first started providing legal technical assistance, we thought we were protecting ourselves from grantees crossing the line with our dollars. What we learned is that it could be a tool for making them far more strategic and effective organizations. And I would say that regardless of what side of an issue you're on, sometimes our issues, if we're dealing with social change, become partisan issues. And the rules don't change. We still have the ability to use a wide array of advocacy tools, even as a private foundation. But compliance with those rules may be more important when you're dealing with opposition to your view of the issues. And so in a time where you might be champion unpopular issues, it's in fact more important to make sure that everybody really knows what the rules are and knows how to use them. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jasmine to talk about the program officer perspective for this work.
So good afternoon. Excuse me. I think that this kind of work is important to a few groups of people. First, of course, are the program staff within a foundation. And then secondly are the grantees and their partners who are working on the various issues that we're funding them for. And I remember when I first had a training on advocacy and how a foundation can work in this space, I sat through a training that went a lot through what we cannot do as a foundation, where we cannot fund, what types of organizations we may not want to work with who are more hard-hitting and do a lot of lobbying and all of that. And going from a small state foundation where I first received that training to a large national foundation that works a lot with more sophisticated organizations, the next round of training I received was sort of the next level of things that we cannot do, especially as a large national organization that doesn't do as much work with smaller grassroots organizations that could do the more hard-hitting advocacy work. And then when Kristen and I started working together, we started to think through and understand, and I started to understand where there are possibilities in this space. And especially as a foundation, we start to look more at health as a social justice issue. There are more organizations who may not be as experienced, but could really do some effective work. So one thing that I've begun to understand in this space is where can we say yes? And where can we look at what can be done, as opposed to thinking at it from the perspective of what we cannot do. And so today's webinar is more about what you can do, where are the spaces where you can think a little bit more creatively about what can happen with your funding, and not so much another training on what you can't do and what to avoid and what's the third rail. I had one experience, again, when Kristen and I started working early together, where we were at a grantee meeting together, and they brought up that they were invited to speak to a state legislative committee. And from the training I'd had prior to this, I was ready to say, well, no, I don't think we can do that. And before I fully got the sentence out, Kristen said, well, let's think through how we can do this. You know, and she started asking questions of them. And as we started having the conversation, we found that there was a way that the grantee would be able to speak in a state legislative hearing. And also, trainings like this and having these kinds of conversations with your legal counsel and with the grantee early on also helps you avoid any last-minute crises or mistakes they may happen further on into a campaign or into a grant period. And I also had that experience where a grantee was part of a larger citywide coalition, and coalition members wanted to write a letter urging the mayor and certain city council members to pass a particular policy. And that grantee, not having had these kinds of early conversations, this was a different grantee, not having had these kinds of early conversations with Kristen and myself, signed on to the letter, not necessarily understanding that because they were being funded by foundation dollars, and the letter explicitly outlined a particular policy, that was not so much a good idea to sign on to the letter. And so we ended up having a conversation with that grantee. We smoothed it all out. They understood better next time. But if we had engaged them earlier and really talked through all the different ways that they can act within this coalition, then we possibly could have avoided that situation early on. So these kinds of early conversations, this type of legal TA that goes on at the start of the grant and all the way throughout the grant period, makes the work much more effective and helps both program officers and grantees and even partners within a campaign understand where they can move within the foundation dollars in addition to any other lobbying dollars that they've received. I'll turn it over to Alan to kick us off and going a little deeper.
Great, thanks so much, Jasmine. Let me switch over to our PowerPoint. Next slide here. So Jasmine and Kristen are talking through all this from the foundation side, and I'm a lawyer who is at a small firm, and I represent foundations and nonprofits. So I'm going to talk about this from the grantee side of things. And as Jasmine and Kristen said, foundation program officers and legal counsel often have concerns about not getting in trouble. But grantees are also concerned about not getting in trouble. They don't want to have their funding clawed back by a foundation if they mess up. They don't want to show a foundation that, hey, we're kind of risky because we don't know what we're doing. They're trying to get their funding renewed. And most importantly, they don't want to ask questions of the foundation if they are concerned about where's the legal line. They get a letter that's full of hopefully not too much mumbo jumbo, but they get a letter from a foundation that says you're not allowed to do any lobbying, and it has some citations to the Internal Revenue Code. And for most grantees, if they're not a really large organization, they don't have legal counsel internally, and they don't know where that line is. They don't know how to comply with that letter that they've gotten that says don't cross the lobbying line. So if you see on your screen here, we've got the work a 501c3 public charity can do. It's got issue education on one side of the blue line, and they've got lobbying on the other side of the blue line. And because they don't want to ask their foundation program officer, hey, can I do this, or is that crossing the line? Because they don't want to look ignorant to the program officer. If they don't have access to legal TA funds, they're going to go to about here. They're not going to go right up to the line. They're going to hold back and play it safe. And what we found working with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is that they're playing it too safe. Because they don't know where that line is, sure, some of them are stumbling over the line out of ignorance if they don't get legal TA funding. But far too often they're staying way back from the line. And what we want, all of us want, is we all want our grantees to get right up to that line so that they can use their restricted dollars for every type of activity that they possibly can. And that way they can save their unrestricted dollars from non-foundation sources or from unrestricted grants for the lobbying when that scarce lobbying money is going to have the biggest impact. So if they know the rules because they've been getting legal TA, they're not wasting any money by holding back. If you think of a marathon analogy, the course of passing legislation is like running a marathon, but most of the activity is non-lobbying. And the reality is the lobbying line is like at mile 23. So if you really know the rules, you can get up to mile 23 with your grant dollars. Your restricted grant dollars can get you up to mile 23. And then you just need some lobbying dollars and a concentrated sprint to get from mile 23 to the end. Unfortunately, too many grantees who don't know where the line is think, oh, I'd better play it safe and only use my grant funding up to about mile 16. And then they try to stretch that lobbying dollars from mile 16 to 26.2, and it doesn't go far enough, and they can't be as effective as they should be. And so what the legal TA program is teach them what the rules are so they can get their toes all the way up to the line and use their lobbying dollars for when they're going to have the biggest impact. So very briefly, we're not going to treat this. We assume you all know what the rules are. This isn't a training, but just so we're all fluent, there are two types of lobbying. There's direct lobbying, which are communications directly to legislators or legislative staffers, or in some cases executive branch officials. But it's a communication directly to a legislator or staffer that reflects a view on pending legislation or proposed legislation. There's another type of lobbying, which is grassroots lobbying, and that's a public communication that refers to specific legislation or a specific legislative proposal. It reflects a view on that legislation, and in order for it to be grassroots lobbying, it has to include a call to action. And the call to action has to be the IRS definition of a call to action, meaning urging a person to contact a legislator or certain other actions that really push the recipient of that communication to want to contact the legislator, to want to take action. And so what we do through the legal TA program is we drill down through each of these prongs in the definitions so that they understand what's lobbying and what isn't. And we're going to go through some examples later on of how grantees have leveraged this. But something that's surprising to many grantees and frankly to many foundation program officers is you can, as a grantee, you can place articles, you can place an op-ed, write an op-ed in your newspaper advocating that the legislature pass or defeat a particular piece of legislation. So in North Carolina, you could use foundation restricted grant dollars to write op-eds saying defeat HB 2 because it's discriminatory. You can spend your money organizing editorial board meetings, doing all sorts of public advocacy and public outreach, including sending out mail and asking people to take action by contacting your organization if they're interested and want to receive more information about the organization's efforts to defeat HB2, for example. So there's a huge amount of advocacy that grantees can do if they just understand the rules and they have access to legal counsel who understands the rules that can help get them to be more strategic about what they're doing. So with that, Kristen, you want to take this over? I think you're muted, Kristen.
Sure, thank you. And we'll go through, we've talked a lot about legal TA at this point without really defining it. This is a program that we started about 3 years ago at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The way that we define legal technical assistance is that we provide a small bolus of funds within our grant that is provided directly to grantees and is used to obtain outside legal counsel for training, strategic planning, and quick feedback on specific questions. And we believe you really need to provide grantees with all of those things. Grantees need training on the front end to really understand the context. Sometimes they really need to be able to apply these rules in the very particular context in which they're currently working on a particular campaign, on a particular subject matter. We've learned over time that providing just a very general training, like something you could provide off a shelf without giving them examples, doesn't really work. They also need someone to help them think about their whole campaign and what they're doing and how to use those dollars most effectively, as Alan pointed out. And that front-end strategic planning also avoids the kind of pitfalls that Jasmine talked about when grantees don't really understand things at the front end. And then finally, opportunities arise. Grantees need to be able to have someone who can help them understand and unpack how they can take on those opportunities. Can they use unrestricted dollars? Can they use restricted dollars? Can they use unrestricted dollars, or do they need to use restricted dollars like lobbying dollars or not? We make sure that the grantee hires the counsel. I'm aware of some other organizations that hire counsel and the counsel provides some assistance to the grantees, but we want to make sure that the relationship is between the grantee and the attorney. It's protected by the attorney-client privilege, and only the grantee and the attorney know what the content of those conversations are. We also use a list of recommended lawyers. If a grantee has existing counsel who has a deep knowledge of these rules and a good relationship with that counsel, they are free to use our dollars to support that relationship. But most often we find that grantees may have called counsel once or twice on a variety of issues, but many grantees, particularly at the grassroots level, don't have that kind of deep relationship with someone with this expertise. And so by having a small list of recommended lawyers, we can tell you these people are used to working with grantees like you. They're used to dealing with your issues, and they'll be able to answer your questions really quickly. In addition, when grantees in a particular area, like say childhood obesity work, use one counsel consistently, and this is what has happened with Alan Madison in our childhood obesity advocacy work, that lawyer begins to understand the legislative landscape of that work and can inform the grantees much more quickly about the work that they can or can't do with their foundation dollars. In addition, when you use a few lawyers who represent a lot of your grantees, those lawyers can have conversations with foundation staff like me, foundation counsel, and talk about questions that the grantees have or issues that they're facing without identifying the grantees. It also helps us identify trends. If grantees are struggling with a particular question that's coming up and they're not sure if it's lobbying or not lobbying and they need more help, because Alan works with many of our grantees, he's able to have that conversation with me and we can figure out a systematic solution. Also, representation to multiple grantees that face the same issues is incredibly cost effective. A lawyer who knows the rules but may not know the particular context that you work in. Are certain things legislation? Are they administrative rules? And And someone who is already up to speed in the area in which you're advocating can make a big difference. So what does this legal TA look like? Typically, for our grants, if we identify a grant program or a particular grantee who is doing advocacy work and would benefit from legal technical assistance, we provide about 3% of the total grant budget to support legal technical assistance. That can be a one-time investment. If it's a new grantee, if it's a grantee who just seems to need some help doing training or understanding the rules, you can just make that investment one time. In some cases, it's important to provide grantees ongoing support, particularly if there are ongoing opportunities. But it's important to note that as grantees become more and more sophisticated, the longer they have that strategic relationship with counsel, the less they need the hand-holding. They really build up that those skills within their own organization. I talked about focusing on a small list of approved lawyers. We also really focus on the expertise of the counsel and also their cultural fit. If you use a counsel who only represents large foundations and bigger institutional funders, then that may not be a good cultural fit with a small grassroots organization. We've also looked at geography and other factors that may be important. And we also encourage grantees to really build a relationship with the counsel. It's not just about calling the counsel when you have problems, but it's about sitting down with counsel on the front end of whatever your project is and explaining it to them and having them help you think about it in a strategic way. Finally, we approve trainings and customized materials. Those are all approved expenditures for our program, as well as in-person meetings. In fact, we encourage those because we find that grantees who have met counsel are much more likely to call counsel with questions later on. But you can also use webinars if you don't have an opportunity to bring your grantees and counsel together. This program can be as big or small as you want. We've been approached by some foundations who don't have a budget as big as RWJF and perhaps are new to the advocacy space and are intrigued by this idea, but say we just don't have a lot of money to throw at something like this. I will tell you that in most cases, $5,000 or $10,000 can make a huge difference, and often that's all that a small grassroots organization needs to give them a bit of help, particularly if a lawyer is representing a number of these grantees. So with that, I will turn it back to Jasmine to talk about Jasmine talked a little bit about the perspective of a program officer before, but talk about the benefits that she's seen over time with this that kind of legal technical assistance that I just described.
So thanks, Kristen. So for any of you who work on advocacy or who have worked with grantees that do advocacy work, even if it's not necessarily with your own dollars, you all would know that lobbying money is really, really hard to come by. They're usually small amounts. They're usually very restricted. Grantees have to work very hard to get these lobbying dollars from other foundations or individual contributors. And so when they're putting together a campaign on an important issue, being able to use other grant dollars for this campaign helps to save those precious lobbying dollars for them to be able to use with laser-like focus to move a certain issue further down the field. And so this type of funding with Legal TA frees up those scarce lobbying dollars, allows them to use them as they really, really need to, and it gives them that experience in understanding how to use these other funds more strategically for advocacy work, whether it's doing media, whether it's training community members, whether it's hosting meetings, travel, that sort of thing that all come along with doing an effective campaign. We have a program called Voices for Healthy Kids in partnership with the Heart Association that funds campaigns mainly on city and state levels, and these organizations that apply are able to use those grant dollars, and we ask them how much lobbying dollars they have. And they're able to use those grant dollars to leverage the lobbying dollars that they have, save those precious lobbying dollars for more effective work, and use the grant money to really further boost up their campaign work. It also helps build the capacity of the organizations who receive this funding, whether it's through Voices for Healthy Kids, where we're able to fund smaller organizations that really know how to do this work and represent the most vulnerable groups, or if it's larger organizations that are coming new into an advocacy space. When I go back to that example of a grantee who inadvertently signed on to a letter that crossed the lobbying line, after that happened and we sat down and talked with them, we helped them understand when they have those lobbying dollars, and they do, where to use it, where to put that hat on, and where to take it off, so that they can use our grant dollars more effectively without crossing any lobbying lines. And over the years, that organization has become so good at this that they have partnered with other organizations across the state to start a statewide campaign. They have effectively led other city-focused campaigns and have really run with being able to be an effective advocate on both the city and state level, bring on additional partners to increase the capacity of the folks that are doing the work, and even bring on additional funding partners, because they've been able to show that they know where the line is, they know just how close they can get to it, and how to be able to use both lobbying and non-lobbying dollars effectively to make good city and state policy happen. So Alan, I think we're going back to you.
Terrific. Oops, let me just, hold on, sorry about that. So now that we've talked about what the legal TA program is and how it can be beneficial, I wanted to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of how to use this program to leverage strategic thinking so that your grantees and so that nonprofits can use your money more strategically to take advantage of what isn't lobbying once they know what the rules are. So there are a few examples of this. One is building long-term advocacy power using non-lobbying funds. This is an example of a way that RWJF, the tweets on the screen, RWJF engaged with a variety of legislators to show, to get information out, just to push forward a report that they had done on childhood obesity here. You can leverage these non-lobbying funds in lots of strategic ways. One that's going to be, I think, extremely important coming up under the Trump administration will be nonprofits lobbying their legislators, both on social media and directly and through the media, through the mainstream media, asking legislators to weigh in on proposed legislation. So if the EPA or HHS has a new regulation under the Trump administration that's going to change what the Obama administration had done, get grantees to understand that administrative regulations are not lobbying, so you can go ahead and ask a legislator to weigh in with the head of HHS. Certainly if you target legislators who sit on the Appropriations Committee or sit on the authorizing committee of that particular agency, the agency staff are going to be much more receptive to that congressman or that senator calling up than they would be if your organization just got grassroots supporters to call the agency or submit comments. So these work hand in hand with your grassroots outreach. You can use restricted non-lobbying funds to pressure your legislators to contact members of the administration to change regulations. It's just one of the many strategic ways that you can use non-lobbying funds to pressure and build and create relationships with those legislators. And then, of course, after you've developed that relationship with the legislator, turn them into a champion. Turn your senator into a champion on your issue and had her weigh in with the administrative agency on regulations. After you've basically used your non-lobbying foundation funds to turn her into a champion, and when you need her on legislation, you won't need to invest as much money in building that relationship. That relationship was built with non-lobbying funds. You can just go in with your lobbying funds and advocate for the legislation using those different dollars, not your foundation restricted grant dollars. Another strategic advantage is supporting your legislative battles directly. This is an example. If you understand the definition of call to action for grassroots lobbying, here's an organization that ran an ad in a newspaper thanking a senator for legislation that he had introduced. They understood the rules very carefully, so they very carefully designed this ad so that it wouldn't be lobbying under the IRS rules, even though many people would think an ad thanking a sponsor for their Healthy Food Financing Act would be, sort of in the colloquial term, lobbying. And this campaign, here's an example for some of the same campaign from Voices for Healthy Children in Alabama. They got front page story on the Montgomery Advertiser. They hit 2.5 million Alabamians. They really leveraged these rules in a strategic way to push their issue, and you wouldn't expect it, but Alabama passed healthy food financing legislation because they were really strategic about saving their lobbying dollars for right at the end when they were going to have the maximum impact, and they stretched those restricted grant funds as far as they could. And the third way that you can take advantage of the rules is by leveraging the exceptions in the rules. So for example, here's an invitation letter to the American Heart Association lobbyist in Minnesota asking her to testify before his committee on, I think this was on safe streets funding. Here they used foundation restricted dollars to write their testimony about active transportation options. They can use restricted grant dollars from the foundation to pay for their travel, pay for an overnight hotel if they need it, so that they can talk to these legislators and testify why the bill, there was a bill in front of this committee, why was the funding bill so important? And this letter didn't come out of the blue to the lobbyist, of course. I wrote the letter. I wrote the letter at the request of Rachel Callanan, sent the text to chairman's chief of staff, who put it on the letterhead and emailed it right back. Because she had this letter, it's like a Willy Wonka magic ticket. She could go ahead and use restricted dollars to lobby. Not to lobby. She could use restricted dollars to testify. Unfortunately, we've had other grantees who didn't understand exactly how the rules worked. They went ahead and testified without getting the proper invitation, and they wound up having to have their grant dollars clawed back by the foundation because they were lobbying, even though they were doing the exact same thing, testifying in front of a committee. If you don't have your I's dotted and your T's crossed properly, it goes from an exempt activity to being lobbying. So once you understand the rules, now the fun part begins. And we're going to use an example here of a lobbying campaign to put sidewalks and better lighting along city streets. And this is straight out of an actual legal TA question that we received as one of from one of the projects that RWJF funded, but because we have this attorney-client privilege, Kristen has no idea which grantee it was. But anyways, they had a proposal for $75,000 lobbying campaign to get sidewalks and streetlights installed in their city. And they didn't have $75,000, so they had gone to some funders and they got some legal TA money, and they came to me and they said, well, what can we do here? So the first line item we looked at was, okay, so you're spending $10,000 on printing fact sheets and other materials. And I said, why is that a lobbying cost? And they said, well, it's because it's about a bill. And it wasn't about this particular bill, but this is an example of a fact sheet about a bill. So here's a fact sheet about the HEAL Act in Illinois, advocating for passage of the HEAL Act. And they were going to use it in a whole variety of settings. They were going to get it out to their allies and other organizations. They were going to get it out to gym teachers. They were going to get it to nutritionists, pediatricians, and they were going to use it for their lobby day. I said, you know what? Under the definitions of lobbying, that $10,000 printing cost doesn't have to be a lobbying cost. You can spend non-lobbying dollars on that fact sheet advocating for the HEAL Act. So we moved $10,000 in their budget down to non-lobbying. The next we looked at their $25,000 advertising budget. They had radio and print ads, they had bus ads, they had ads in bus shelters, billboards, and as we were discussing it, just like this print ad from Alabama, we said if you don't include a call to action, these are public communications. You can talk about the bill in your advertising without having to use lobbying dollars. So we broke it down, and they realized $5,000 of lobbying was going to be really important to say, call your legislators, and they named the specific city council members. They said, call these city council members in these districts. And they said, online ads, people are actually going to convert, and they will actually contact their legislator. A bus shelter ad, if someone's sitting there waiting for their bus shelter, they can take the phone out, they scan a QR code, and they could call or email directly to that legislator while they're waiting for the bus. Now, people who are sitting in a bus shelter are probably the ones who want sidewalks and street lights on their street. So that was a really smart, targeted advertising buy, and it was worth spending $5,000 in lobbying funds. Of course, radio ads, no one's going to listen to a radio ad and call their legislator. And an ad on the side of a bus that's driving by you, it's going by too fast unless there's a lot of traffic, but it's going by too quickly for you to write down the phone number on the side of a bus. So there's no reason to have a call to action that says, call your legislator at this phone number on the side of a bus. Instead, the bus ads simply said, we need safe streets, pass the safe streets bill now, because that's all you can really read when the bus is driving by you. All right, so now we've shifted $30,000 into non-lobbying to be paid for with restricted foundation grant dollars. Next, we looked at the online buy. We realized, well, some tweets, like the first one here, some of the social media that you're looking to do, it's non-lobbying. But some of the tweets are going to directly contact legislators in their tweet, or they're going to provide the legislators' contact information. So those would be lobbying. We went through their online ad, we went through the website and figured out that we can allocate half the budget to social media, and grassroots lobbying emails would be hugely effective for lobbying, and we could put half the budget down in non-lobbying advocacy. So you get the drift at this point, right? As we shifted, the $5,000 for lobby day, it's got to be lobbying, and it's going to be really useful. Similarly with the contract lobbyist, keep it in lobbying dollars. Use your lobbying dollars where they're going to be most effective. The staff organizer, though, she had a staff salary of $25,000, and because we were spending so much money on non-lobbying, we shifted her budget down to $10,000 of lobbying and $15,000 of non-lobbying funds. So she was going to be drawing her salary from two different places. Overall, we wound up from that $75,000 lobbying campaign, we wound up with a $47,500 request that we could go to foundations with, and they could fund with their non-lobbying dollars. And it meant that we had essentially a third as much money that we needed to get from tough donors like individuals and other sources that could give lobbying dollars. So let me pass it on back to you, to Jasmine.
So Kristen's going to take it from here and bring us home.
That's my plan anyway. So thank you, Alan. And I think, in conclusion, we want to open it up for questions, is to say that we invite you to think about providing this kind of assistance and capacity building to grantees as a real strategy tool. What Alan showed you is not about being aggressive. It's about using the IRS rules to the full extent we are allowed and never crossing the line. And giving the grantees that kind of magic we've seen over time, it can really, really make a difference in what they can accomplish and what they can do after the grant ends with other funders and with other funding. So it's a win for the program officer who doesn't end up with the kinds of problems on her hands that Jasmine talked about early on, and knowing that your money is really going to be leveraged to the full extent. As someone who works in compliance for a foundation, I don't want our dollars to be used inappropriately, and this gives me the confidence to allow us to give grants or advise us to give grants even to organizations that don't necessarily have the infrastructure and the capacity in this area from day one, because I know that we can get them where we need to get them. And then finally, it's a win for grantees, and it means that we are engaging in very strategic action. We have stronger organizations, And that leads to lasting social change. And so the whole idea of this is not to push the envelope. It's actually to give everyone the tools they need to do this work well. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
So this is Biz. I just want to encourage folks to type your questions into the question box. Long or short, anything that relates to your work or the content of the presentation. Just type them in there and we'll be able to see them and we'll answer them directly.
And I should also say, if some of you want to ask us questions offline, Biz can provide contact information, and we'll be happy to talk with you about our experience in this area. We have created kind of large-scale legal technical assistance programs for groups of grantees. We've also scaled it down for individual grantees and grantees who just need a little bit of help. So it's totally scalable, and we'd be happy to share our experiences in that.
Well, we know we're coming up on the hour and that it's, as I said at the beginning, a complicated day to say the least. So I will definitely take you guys up on that offer to be sharing contact information and hope that folks can continue conversations with you directly there. I'm sure there are a whole variety of ways that hopefully we can put this into motion, and as things evolve, some great conversations that can continue between everyone on the call. Thank you so much for all the work you guys have done to put this together and for sharing so much really tangible, real work that you've been able to do in partnership with others across the country. So I'm excited. Oh, great, we have a question. I have to say before we get to the question, I'm super grateful to all of you, so thank you. And then I will.
Thank you, Biz. For foundations that are new to advocacy, what's the best way to get a sense of the policy landscape around a particular area? I'll ask Jasmine to respond to that question as well, but I think use your sister and brother foundations. That's what we do when we're trying to learn a new policy area. Understand their experience, understand where their levers are. Sometimes the best levers are not legislative levers, they're administrative levers or other kinds, and understanding where they've had success, where they've had failures, where there's good capacity on the ground, where it's still nascent, is really something that you can lean on your fellow funders to help you understand. Jasmine, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, also I will add your grantees are also great resources of information if any of them are working in that particular space. You may not be funding them for that issue, but they may be working in that issue. And so I think asking them too, what are some of the issues that you need to take a look at as you begin to explore a new area?
Great. Thank you all. So without getting too much more into the content, it looks like we're getting a lot of appreciation from the question box. So thank you guys all. And please join us for future webinars and follow up on the EPIP website for the archive and ways to stay in conversation with our presenters. So thank you, Kristen, Jasmine, and Alan. And I hope everyone has a safe and peaceful rest of your day.
Thanks for having us, Biz.
Thank you, everyone.